And good afternoon, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Welcome to the program. If you'd like to join live, then and you're watching either on YouTube or Periscope or Twitch or D Live or Twitter or any of the other subscribers, all you need to do, since I'm doing this by Zoom today, is click on the Zoom chat room or the Zoom meeting, and I will then admit you to the meeting, and you can either speak and be heard, you can chat, you can type, in which I'll read your comment, or you can be seen. You can be seen and heard right here at this program. It's amazing what technology can do. Anyways, I just want to continue reporting on what I see as the ugliness of this upcoming election. Anything to defeat Trump, anything to stop President Trump, anything to end his presidency. And I would argue that the effort has been going on since the minute he was elected, that it is international, it's not just domestic. It has everything to do with the fact that he wants to um, improve and increase and emphasize American sovereignty, American interests, American industry, American labor, and American way of life, and that this is the most anathematic, the most anti idea, the enemy of the internationalists, the globalists, those who speak in very high sounding sophistries, but who actually are using a form of double talk that many people have become used to. It's kind of like what French scholar Elaine Benescon referred to as the language of totalitarianism. President Trump stated when he ran, and he's fulfilling this, that his interest as president of the United States would be to do just that, be president of the United States, not president of the world, not president of some kind of gauzy attempt to create some kind of a new world order. President Trump believes in the existing world order, which is that man was created in the image of God, and that there is a logos, as Dr. E. Michael Jones accurately calls it, to civilization, to life. That there is an order to the universe, and that you cannot replace that with some kind of a man-made new world order, which is, of course, the agenda of the internationalists and many on the top levels of industry and finance and influence. And President Trump stepped in, and even though past presidents have made motions to this, everyone knows that it was BS. They're just saying it to get elected. President Trump really meant what he said. He wants to return sovereignty to the people under God and to take it away from these massive unelected bureaucracies, many of which are international and none of which are accountable to the citizen, many of which we don't even know who they are. And he wanted to return that sovereignty to the citizen. That was what was his election was all about. I would suggest that the listener and viewer here read his incredible inauguration speech, where he lays it out in no uncertain terms. You can look it up on Google. It's fantastic. I'm not going to reread it here. I probably should, but we'll just refer to it. But you have to read that to understand exactly why he ran, why he was elected, and what, in fact, he is carrying out as president. Since he's been president, his presidency has been the most active and the most successful since the first 1,000 days of the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Whether or not Roosevelt was good or not, that's another story for another day. But the fact is that he got a lot done in his first 1,000 days. It's one of these things that's heralded, and for better or for worse, but he did. And I would argue that Donald Trump's presidency has been equally as dynamic. First of all, he got rid of some of these very negative and destructive international agreements like the Pacific Treaty, the PPP, and the International Climate Treaty, which was nothing more than a transfer of wealth to a bunch of shadowy bureaucracies. It wouldn't have done anything to take a single molecule of carbon out of the atmosphere. And he got rid of some of these other phony treaties that did nothing but erode sovereignty, hurt American position in the world in terms of our industrial growth and our labor. And he returned that power back to his country. This is a movement all over the world. I mean, this is what Brexit is all about in the Great Britain. This is a movement, if you look at Eastern European countries, where they're reasserting their sovereignty. I mean, this is, I would argue, a positive and indeed a progressive movement. He has reduced taxes. He signed a tax cut. He's reduced onerous regulation on business, which allows businesses to expand, particularly minority businesses. He has been for minorities, particularly Black people. He has been probably the best president since, I don't know, Lincoln, I would say. I mean, he's got rid of some of these horrible laws that were put in place during the Clinton administration and that were promoted by, at the time, Senator Joe Biden, which put thousands, tens of thousands of people, predominantly Black men, in prison for minor crimes, things like carrying a nickel bag of marijuana and whatnot. President Trump has taken a major step to getting rid of that with the First Step Act, which is what it implies. It's only the first step in what will be many more acts as his presidency continues. And that one particular act ended up helping the release of up to 10,000 prisoners, 90% of whom were African American men. He's the first president to fund historic Black colleges on a permanent basis. I mean, he's the first president to support business practices that help Black entrepreneurs and businesses in the inner city. He has gotten rid of criminal elements which plague the city and which kill Black people and destroy Black businesses, particularly drug gangs, many of whom are illegal aliens. He's helped get rid of them. And all of this with resistance. And we could go through the list. I mean, he's reduced America's footprint in the world in terms of war. He's de-escalated in the Middle East. He's de-escalating now in Europe, calling troops home who have been there since World War II, who have been there since the fall of the Soviet Union, which was now 30 years ago, I think 40 years ago now. And he's done a lot of things that liberals claimed they supported all these years. But in reality, their leaders did not support this, and their followers did, but they kind of looked the other way. Now President Trump is doing this, and for the benefit of the United States. I would suggest that the world is a more peaceful place as a result. With regard to my fellow Jews, he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, which had been promised by several administrations and which had been passed by Congress in the 1980s, thus strengthening Israel's position in Jerusalem. He's been very pro-Israel. He has not pressured Israel to negotiate with terrorists, which is unlike previous administrations. I mean, he's, and yet, we see all these, well, I'll get into that in a minute, but he's, we could take a look at across the board a very successful presidency. But his enemies are getting uglier and nastier as the election approaches in their attempt to overthrow him. Now, I started by talking about the international element of this, and I know I'm getting into theory here, but I would suggest that this played out in terms of the upcoming pandemic earlier this year. We now know that the World Health Organization, which is highly influenced by Communist China, and I don't think this is in dispute, they hid and sat on the information about the Wuhan virus for, I believe, at least a month, if not 5 weeks, before they eventually went public with it. They claimed, even as recently as mid-January, that the Wuhan virus did not pass from person to person. Now, during that critical period of time, the virus spread all over the world. It was not because no one thought that it was lethal. And by the time they admitted that it had already spread to the United States. And we now know that. And once that did become public, President Trump took steps. He banned flights from China. Other than Chinese American citizens. He required things like temperatures at the airports and things like that. Maybe he could have done more, but he certainly did take pretty strenuous steps. And the result is that he did reduce the spread of the virus, probably saved hundreds of thousands of people from being exposed to the virus, and probably many, many lives. And that his opposition to that was the Democratic left. People like Nancy Pelosi, who went to Chinatown in late February and said, "Come on down, everything's fine here. Let's go, go out to restaurants, go to have, attend parties and go out in public." This was when it was already fairly well known that this thing was spreading and that people needed to shelter. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, and again, I know this might be controversial, and I have no idea, but it's not going to stop me from speculating that the World Trade Organization, running along in cahoots with the American enemies of Trump, primarily the Democratic Party, but others, deliberately stalled this information in order to make the virus more lethal, because then it could be used politically. That seems to be what's happened. And that every time President Trump stepped in and made suggestions about how to reduce the virus, like, for example, the use of hydroxychloroquine as a preventative or to save lives, which apparently it does, according to thousands of doctors around the world, and it has been used successfully in Italy and in France and in several South American countries. Every time he would do this, it would be ridiculed, it would be attacked by the establishment and all of these people who are in this terrible and ugly war against the Trump administration, whether they're witting or otherwise. And thus the thing continued to spread. And they also insisted on this complete lockdown, which was overreach. We could have social distanced, we could have put on masks, we could have taken reasonable precautions. We could have maybe, certainly done a better job of locking down the most vulnerable in our society, people in nursing homes, which not only didn't they do, but they actually were by mandate in several states. Ironically, the so-called blue states, they were putting people who had the active virus in nursing homes, with thousands of people died. I mean, it just came out yesterday in Massachusetts, my own state, that 60% of the deaths approximately were people in nursing homes. I think that figure probably is pretty constant across the country, and it's probably low compared to other states like New York, where it's probably more like 70%, maybe higher. We also know that of those who did not die from COVID-19 in nursing homes, probably I'd like to see a stat on the number of people who were either over 80 years old or who had pre-existing conditions. I think that once you identify that, it's probably, who knows, it's probably closer to 90, 95%. We know that only 1% of people who actually contracted this terrible disease had to be hospitalized, and of them, probably a smaller percentage of them died. And that's a horrible thing. I'm not here to say, hey, let's go out and have a party. I mean, this is a disease, it needs to be treated as such. But the point I'm making is that the lockdown, to me, looks like overreach, and it may have a political component, which was to hurt the economy and thus hurt President Trump. And I mean, it sounds horrible to say this. How could people be that evil and that diabolical? But if you look at the trend of this anti-Trump movement, I mean, I think it's very plausible to suggest that they do anything to stop this movement that they believe in so fervently as a faith, which is the globalist movement, the idea of merging the world into a one world ant colony, and that President Trump posed a real and tactile threat to the progress of that movement. They didn't want people to wake up to it, and people were waking up to it as the economy got better and as more, individual liberty was improving. And so, yeah, they feel perfectly justified to take these kinds of moves, like destroying an economy and wiping out small businesses, particularly minority business, creating massive unemployment, creating huge suffering and poverty, and terrible dislocation in our economy. Not to mention the fact that they get to use authoritarian power at least on the state level, and try to goad Trump into doing it on a national level, which is something that they love, and that they it's addictive to them. If you take a look at some of these governors, anyways, as that sort of winded down, and previously, as probably the biggest conspiracy theory of the 20th century, the past 100 years, this idea that Donald Trump is a Russian spy, that was proven false after 3 years. And after the so-called, the perfect phone call became an impeachable offense, that didn't really fly too well. It didn't really make any difference. And after they misused and I think amplified and overreached on the pandemic to try to hurt the economy and hurt people and use authority, once that started to wind down because people started to ignore it and go out, then you have the obvious, the predictable. It's almost like clockwork, that they're going to find an incident they could magnify and claim, and in this case accurately, probably, that it's a racial incident, and that somehow, even without saying it, it is to be associated with Donald Trump, because after all, Trump is not on the left, and the left is virtuous. They're not racist. This is the same playbook that they used actually against Mitt Romney in 2012 with the Trayvon Martin killing. This was magnified as a racial attack. Trayvon Martin was killed because he was black. Never mind the fact that the media actually doctored the tape of the man who killed him. Never mind the fact that the man who killed him was not white. None of that was relevant. It all was brought up with the implicit accusation, even though they didn't come out with it outwardly, that the Republicans and Mitt Romney are to blame because they don't like black people. And it worked for them. It created this kind of emotional response, particularly among African Americans, but also among the population, the liberal population at large. And when you run those things on television day after day and in the media, it does have an effect. You never heard the end of it. That thing went on right from when it happened right up to election day. We never heard anything but those sorts of accusations. Well, the same, I think, dynamic is going on now with the George Floyd killing, which is horrible. But obviously, Donald Trump and Republicans had nothing to do with it. It happened in a very liberal city, in a liberal state. Minneapolis having a police department that was seen as cutting edge in terms of dealing with racial injustice and was making major reforms. And and we had, of course, in Minneapolis, a district attorney who looked the other way on this very bad cop who had been involved with killing other people, and it was really a bad apple. He should have been removed from the police department. That DA being Amy Klobuchar, a presidential candidate for the Democrats. Yet somehow this is going to be blamed on Trump, and so, like clockwork, almost as if it was planned, because it was planned, you had terrorists starting to loot black neighborhoods, kill black people, burn black businesses across the country. The federal government, President Trump's government, actually thwarted this very quickly with very good work, a story that needs to be told. They found, piles of bricks, and they found gas canisters and other things set aside in different parts of cities that we're going to use to create a race war. Anything to win, anything to stop Trump, with the hope that they could goad him into declaring martial law, just like they did with the pandemic, or that they could goad him into taking extreme action, which he didn't do in any case. And we're never going to hear the end of that. That's going to be every day between now and election day. And now they're reigniting the Civil War. They want to tear down Confederate monuments like that of Robert E. Lee in Virginia, who, by the way, in spite of his flaws and in spite of the fact that he was a traitor during the Civil War, he led the effort after the war and after Appomattox to sort of stitch back the nation. Whatever happened to the spirit of Appomattox, where the South and the North worked to try to mend the past and to move forward. That's all out the window now. They're going to reignite a war that was won probably, what is it, 150 years ago, just to try to stop Trump by labeling him, in this effort to label him a racist. And they're also resorting to this kind of like really petty and ridiculous tea leaf reading kind of conspiracy theories. Oh, he's having a rally on this day because this was a day of this in history that was, you know, not good for slaves, or he's doing it in this city, the city of Tulsa, because Tulsa had a race riot. I mean, hello, is there something wrong with Tulsa, Oklahoma today? I mean, then this is somehow deliberate. He's sending secret messages to his supporters that we don't like black men and women. It's ugly, and these are lies. I mean, the most ridiculous one I've seen yet is that he referred to the Secret Service by initials SS. Oh, that's like what the Nazis did. This must mean he loves Hitler. He's sending a message to all of the rest of us Hitler lovers to get behind him. I mean, it's gotten to be that crazy that this is like the kind of stuff that I used to hear a lot on the right, actually, when I was broadcasting at the American Freedom Network, and they would have people, taking a microscope to every word that's uttered by everyone and saying this is a secret meaning here. It's almost like a complete perversion of the Kabbalah, actually, if we want to get into details, where you have people, who don't know what they're doing and who don't understand the Kabbalah at all and the Zohar, looking for like secret meanings to do this and that. I mean, that's how depraved they've become. And that's what we're looking at now. And that's how we're going to see this attempt to overthrow the president in November. I mean, even Joe Biden, who is very corrupt in his background, we know that, and who is suffering from some pretty obvious health problems mentally, he's thrown out a nice piece of meat in terms of conspiracy theories. Oh, that Donald Trump won't leave the White House if he's defeated. Oh, they love that. We're never going to hear the end of that. Somehow that he's like hungry for power. This has been one of those memes that has been there since the day he was elected. And by the way, I don't happen to know Donald Trump, and I don't know, him personally, but I know enough people who do to know that that's complete hogwash. He's not hungry for power. He's actually, fortunately, and to his credit, he has been very limited in his exercise of presidential power. If he had done what the liberals would have done in the pandemic, he probably would have declared martial law, called out the army, and put people in concentration camps who stepped off their lawn during the lockdown. He didn't do any of that. Instead, he operated entirely within the Constitution by allowing the states to regulate and by using executive oversight to try to blunt some of the extremes of those regulations, which is the appropriate balance of powers. So anyway, it's going to get uglier and uglier as we get closer to the election. They have all the polls saying that President Trump is losing. I don't believe any of it. I think that as the election, things move forward, it's going to get more desperate. They'll stop at nothing. I don't know what else they're going to come up with. They've already come up with a pandemic or the mishandling of it, which has resulted in over 100,000 deaths mostly in nursing homes, which they deliberately put people in. They've come up with the race war. We knew that. That's coming down the pike. I mean, what else could they do on that? I mean, they've already shot their wad on that one by pushing this race conflict. The economy, it's coming back. I mean, I don't know. They're going to blame Trump for unemployment after the pandemic. I mean, I guess. I mean, who knows? I hate to think of what they're going to come up with, but I would just say we better tighten our seatbelts because it's going to be a very bumpy ride between now and Election Day. Let's stay the course. Let's ask reasonable people to consider the fact that we have a good and stable government that has a set of principles and ideals and that we should support that government. The media won't report President Trump's speech the other day in Dallas, where he did lay out some very good ideas with regard to reforming police departments around the country, where he said, no, we shouldn't defund police. We should put more money into the police departments so they can hire social workers to go out in the field and to help police deal with situations. And he had several other very concrete proposals. Now, we can criticize and say, well, why didn't he come up with this before? Okay, fine. Obama didn't come up with any of this. The Bushes never came up with any of it. It's never been come up with at all. So, you know, the fact is that he is developing it now, and we should be supporting these measures. They're reasonable and they're appropriate as a response to this terrible killing, and that we do need police reform. And I think that President Trump will get police reform, unless, of course, the enemies of Trump just want to stop it because of political reasons, which is probably going to be the case. Anyway, I want to thank you for joining me today. Charles Moscowitz here. I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Check out my books. They're available at Amazon Books. Just put my name in the server, Charles Moscowitz, Moscow, like Moscow, Witz, Witz, and you'll see a whole bunch of books come up. I write books on all sorts of topics. Anyway, thanks for joining me, everyone. Have a great afternoon.